very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweigh the dangers which are cited to justify it.
I was recently reminded of this 2,000-year-old quote from Stoic philosopher Cicero, a quote which I first read and considered some 40 years ago. A nation can survive its fools and even the ambitious, but it cannot survive treason from within. An enemy at the gates is less formidable, for he is known and he carries his banners openly. But the traitor moves among those within the gates freely, his sly whispers rustling through all the galleys, heard in the very hall of government itself. For the traitor appears not a traitor. He speaks in the accents familiar to his victims, and wears their face and their garment. And he appeals to the baseness that lies deep in the hearts of all men. He rots the soul of a nation. He works secretly and unknown in the nights to undermine the pillars of a city. He infects the body politic so that it can no longer resist. A murderer is less to be feared. Cicero from 42 BC, 2,000 years ago. These are the things we must consider now, and how many are, whether actively or passively, a part of this sort of tyranny. Something we all must consider. This is Dane Wigington with the weekly edition of Global Alert News for June 3rd, 2017. As always, this is a commercial-free news hour paid for by geoengineeringwatch.org, so we can cover as much of the hard-hitting breaking data as possible in the amount of time we have. This show is broadcast throughout Northern California on 1670 AM, 104.9 FM, and 105.7 FM. Global Alert News is also aired on the East Coast by the PRN Radio Network, Saturdays at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. Recordings of this show on Geoengineering Watch at the recent radio and top stories sections and on the KQMS archives. Another weekly reminder for those who are willing to examine hard data and willing to make their voice heard in the critical battle to sound the alarm. There are free informational materials at Orchard Nutrition in Redding and Shasta County, if you will put those materials to use. Incredibly shocking DVD on 9/11 from 3,000 architects and engineers. If you think you know the truth about 9/11 from the official narrative, think again. Also, there are vaccine documentaries, Silent Epidemic. Find out what you don't know, what you have not been told about vaccines. More on those stories coming up. Breaking news on the countries that are banning vaccinations now. As the truth about vaccinations comes to the surface, there are also climate engineering documentaries, DVDs there at Orchard Nutrition for those who will put those materials to work. Important announcement. Again, the Vaxxed tour bus. The documentary Vaxxed, incredibly compelling documentary on the vaccination dangers with government, scientists, whistleblowers. Their testimony in that DVD, or in that film rather. You can watch that online. I believe it's $3.99 to watch Vaxxed online. Worth every cent if you care about your child. And the Vaxxed tour bus with Vaxxed director Polly Tommy will be in Redding at Orchard Nutrition on June 10th from 11 a.m. to 3 p.m. Please come show your support for those that are sacrificing so much in the fight to expose the vaccination dangers. Again, Polly Tommy, Vax Director, will be there. If you have a vaccine injury story, please come share that story. Help others to wake up. Help others to find the courage to investigate what the medical industrial complex has hidden from us for so long, the immense vaccination dangers. Also today at the Reading Library, June 3rd, from 3:30 p.m. to 5:30 p.m., another free community educational documentary, Take Back Your Power, exposing the extreme dangers from radio frequency exposure. And we're about to go to 5G. Now, these are very detrimental frequencies that those in power are not disclosing. The media they control are not disclosing, just like our local KRCR, Record Searchlight, and other media sources like them. They will not cover these kinds of stories because their paychecks and pensions depend on them not covering these stories. Again, today, June 3rd, 3:30 p.m. to 5:30 p.m., free documentary. There'll be free materials there come find out what you don't know. Now, about vaccinations, some of the global headlines, there's so much to cover today. But to finish this theme on vaccinations now, and what we must all educate ourselves with, Sweden bans mandatory vaccinations over, quote, serious health concerns. Some countries have governments that are not completely controlled by the medical industrial complex. Sweden showing some sign of courage. Let's hope other nations follow suit. Another headline: why Japan banned MMR vaccinations, while our country, in California especially, a requirement or your child can't go to school. Vaccinations that are proven dangerous are being forced on our children, or they're not going to be allowed in school. What kind of country do we live in now? And when people share data like this, and I see emails, I'm included on many emails that are sent around in Shasta County and some throughout other people in the country, to lists of people that we are trying to inform. And it's interesting how some of those people on those lists write the sender of such informative emails back and say, please don't include me on this list. Please BCC me, blind carbon copy me. Isn't that a coward's way out? If we're all trying to share data that's essential to bring this issue to light, how many people want to hide in the shadows? And that's the BCC closet cowards that want that. We need to get this information out in the open. It's not showing courage to hide in the shadows while we have such dire data that needs to be shared. Now on to stories of this last week. There's so many to cover. And what's the latest act in the ongoing power structure political theater of mass distraction? This is very important for people to understand, because from the vaccination dangers to our imploding biosphere to the push for World War III, the power structure is maneuvering rapidly, but they are also very effective at creating drama that distracts the population from what's really going on. We all need to wake up to that fact. And what's the latest major distraction? Before I get to that, and I'm speaking in this case about Mr. Trump pulling out of the Paris Accord and what that's really about. First, I just want to mention, this is an interesting point to consider. Has anybody looked up the definition of Trumpery? It's interesting. If you've never looked it up, take a look. It certainly fits with what we're going through right now. Trumpery. Take a look at your dictionary. And just like the Obamas and the Clintons and the Bushes, all the rest, they're all part of the Trumpery. They're all included. They're just puppets, controlled by those behind the curtain. With that in mind, here's a headline. Donald Trump pulls U.S. out of Paris Accord in crushing blow to climate fight. First, about that headline and about the Paris Accord. The Paris Accord is simply a facade. There was never any real teeth to that accord, never any true facing of reality in that accord, certainly never any mention of the climate engineering assault in that accord. So it's all just a facade to begin with. And Trump pulling out of that accord is also a facade designed to create maximum division and confusion. Trump said this: "I'm fighting every day for the great people of this country." He said this at a press conference at the White House Rose Garden. He went on to say this: "Therefore, in order to fulfill my solemn duty to protect America and its citizens, the United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord." Let's examine the absurdities of this statement. First, in what way is that protecting your country, Mr. Trump? To deny that there's anything wrong with the biosphere? To deny that under your administration, with you simply as the current puppet being manipulated by the power structure, that climate engineering, the most destructive activity ever launched by the human race thus far, and unless we have nuclear exchanges, nuclear cataclysm, which would supersede climate engineering, but mathematically speaking right now, the single greatest threat we face is climate engineering. Have you ever mentioned that, Mr. Trump? And that you're inflicting climate engineering, highly toxic spraying of aerosols into our atmosphere, destroying our ozone layer, disrupting our hydrological cycle, and poisoning every breath we take? Have you done anything to reduce that? Mr. Trump? And the answer is patently no, not at all. In fact, the climate engineering insanity is being ramped up. And the Paris Accord, which never meant anything to begin with, which never had any teeth to begin with, in which there was no point or purpose pulling out other than to create theater and mass division and distraction amongst all those sides of the fence that are all in denial. Every side of the fence is in denial, from the right to the left and everything, most everything in between. I want to read a short message I just got from a government official whom I'm honored to call my friend, whose identity I'm obliged to keep anonymous at this time. He said this: let's see, the Secretary of State is Rex Tillerson, a former CEO of ExxonMobil. The U.S. signs a deal with the Saudi government-owned oil conglomerates, SABIC, for a U.S.-Saudi joint venture in the Texas Gulf region. A fracking venture, no less, not to mention the 10-year, $350 billion arms deal with the Saudi kingdom. And now the USA is pulling out of the Paris Climate Conference deal. The Trump administration is stacked with generals and billionaires. The Secretary of State should be a renowned history professor who makes about $80K a year, like me. No, instead we have the former CEO of the largest oil company in the world, and people don't see any connection here with the behavior that's happening now geopolitically around the globe, pumping up the military-industrial complex, sacking environmental protection, and pressing on with climate engineering at ever more extreme levels. And while this is going on, isn't it profound that we have so-called independent news sites who claim to be fighting climate engineering, but yet who push the very people who are denying it? The poster child of such individuals would be so-called Lord Christopher Monckton, who has been told by the House of Lords to stop calling himself a lord or face legal action. Please look that up. Don't believe me. Lord Monckton is an ardent denier of climate engineering. We have a video produced by InfoWars on, I believe, Thursday the 1st, in which Lord Monckton stated, we have, quote, perfectly calm and sensible weather, when referring to the climate. Really, Mr. Monckton, what planet are you referring to? It's certainly not this one. The last time I had communicated with Lord Christopher Monckton on a radio broadcast, he claimed that all is fine with the environment, all is fine with the oceans. He claimed there is no ocean acidification, the barrier reef is fine. Does Monckton ever back up anything he says with facts, ever? Or does he just continue to rant factless diatribes that have no foundation whatsoever? And many of those factless assurances that there's nothing wrong in the world or the environment are unfortunately gulped down by many who don't want the truth and who refuse to actually investigate the frontline facts. Monckton has stated the Arctic ice cap is getting bigger, Antarctica is also getting bigger, more ice is forming, according to Mr. Monckton. Again, the oceans are fine. And how is it possible that any person who claims, again, I want to reiterate this point, who claims to be against climate engineering would accept anything Lord Monckton, who again is not a lord at all, has to say? Monckton has, as I stated, aggressively denied the critical climate engineering on the record. And if you want the truth and you're willing to actually investigate what I'm saying about Mr. Monckton, who is just featured again on InfoWars and other sites, search this title: Is Global Warming an Inconvenient Lie? And you can see a video of Mr. Monckton ardently denying the climate engineering reality. So why would he be being pushed by sites who claim to fight climate engineering? Does that make sense? And again, I've never asked anyone to believe me. I'm asking you to investigate what I've just stated. And unfortunately at InfoWars, and Alex Jones is behaving like a fossil fuel industry, military-industrial complex lobbyist that claims to be fighting climate engineering out of one side of his mouth and yet helps the climate engineers to cover their tracks out of the other side of his mouth. It is confusing to ponder how anyone, again, takes Mr. Jones seriously at this point with such contradictory behavior. Mr. Jones states it hasn't been warming for 18 years. Not sure where he gets that fact. We just had 3 back-to-back record warm years, each warmer than the last. Records are being shattered all over the globe. India has been in the 120 degree plus range since April. So has Pakistan. So has Africa. Australia having repeated all-time record warm years. Oceans are shattering records for heat all over the planet. Where does this data come from? And for those who believe this data and believe false graphs and charts without looking at frontline film footage of what's happening, so you don't have to believe anybody, you can believe your own eyes. If you're accepting this kind of lie, because we all know we love to hate Al Gore, so therefore we must take the opposite position of anything Mr. Gore says, is that rational or logical? It's not. I don't like Mr. Gore either. Carbon credits are a sham. Doesn't mean that what's happening is not real, and climate engineering is making it worse, not better. So why in all of the rants yesterday from InfoWars, and there were several, including Mr. Monckton and Mr. Jones, very theatrical rants with no facts whatsoever to back them up, why was climate engineering never mentioned? Never in those rants. And how can any of these individuals claim to be fighting climate engineering without mentioning it in such a key point in time when there was so much headline information on the theater of pulling out of the Paris Accord? Anyone who takes such individuals seriously as those who I've just mentioned without any investigation of the facts is part of the problem. Trump, Mr. Jones said, is not a servant of death. In another video yesterday, or on Thursday, Jones said this also: Trump is not a servant of those who kill children. Let's back up to my previous news show coverage of the sale of arms to the Saudis, a total of $350 billion worth of arms that are already being used, US and UK arms sales, to slaughter innocent civilians in one of the poorest countries in the world, Yemen. Where does Mr. Jones come up with this sort of defense of Mr. Trump, which couldn't be further from the truth? And again, Trump is simply a figurehead for the military-industrial complex, as Obama was, as the Clintons were, as the Bushes were. Just a puppet, that's all. And what's really interesting is at the end of such statements, denying climate engineering and claiming Trump as some sort of savior of children in a white cape. I mean, this is the sort of image Mr. Jones tries to paint. And with Rex Tillerson, the head of fossil fuel industry, trashing the planet in countless ways, this whole paradigm, on the InfoWars show, then we get the organic shampoo commercial going on and on about all the organic ingredients, and it's really quite a contrast, the marketing that goes on with this kind of dissemination. So I'm simply trying to say this, that if we really care about facing the most dire issues, and climate engineering should be the top of that list, it's destroying the planet's life support systems. Is it productive to follow sites who put out a constant stream of completely incorrect information that's simply what we want to hear? What we want to believe, that there's nothing wrong with the planet. We can drive our SUVs forever and our Winnebagos, and we can continue to put 100 million tons of carbon into the atmosphere every day, methane, nitrous oxide, all these gases that are causing the heat buildup on our planet, and the same sites that don't even mention climate engineering while they claim to be fighting it? Does that make any sense? So I'll end with this. If individuals like Alex Jones and Lord Monckton are not being paid by the military, industrial, fossil fuel, climate engineering complex, they should be, because they're certainly behaving as lobbyists for those entities. Another headline. This is important to consider when we understand that the theater of pulling out of the Paris conference, which had no teeth to begin with, it was only a show to create division and confusion in order to provide cover for the further ramping up of climate engineering all over the globe. Let's consider this headline. Volcanic, quote, geoengineering may have caused a climate catastrophe that killed most life on Earth. Why is this headline important? Because it's the same effect. The geoengineering that's happening right now is the attempt to mimic this type of mass extinction that happened in the past in order to temporarily cool the planet, but at what cost? At the cost of killing everything on it? From this report, Anyone concerned by the idea that people might try to combat global warming, and not might, it's been going on for 70 years already. Let's keep that in mind. The report continues, by injecting tons of sulfate aerosols, which we know are heavy metal and polymer chemicals, into the Earth's atmosphere, may want to read this article in May 1st in the 2017 issue of the journal Geology. From this report, although the gases that were injected in the atmosphere by massive volcanism rather than the burning of fossil fuels, and let's remember geoengineering programs, they provide a case history that reveals the instability of planetary scale climate dynamics. What's that mean exactly? It means this. When something radical disrupts the equilibrium of the climate, bad things happen. And whether that something radical is extreme volcanic activity, as happened in this previous mass extinction that this report is alluding to, or human activity, including geoengineering, disrupts the climate equilibrium that we had for the last 10,000 years, perhaps one of the most stable periods in Earth's climate ever, bad things happen, and they're happening right now. We are in the 6th great mass extinction right now. This is a mathematical fact that's not disputed. Please investigate. And the rate of species die-off is accelerating radically. By the day, we're up to 300 species of plant, animal, and insect every single day going extinct. That's 15,000 times background rates. That's 1.5 million% of normal. That's not normal, is it? So in summary, let's consider the experiment from which there is no return, that the power structure has long since decided to initiate without the knowledge or consent of the population, planetary geoengineering, filling the sky with thousands of fossil fuel guzzling jet aircraft that spew out tens of millions of tons of highly toxic nanoparticulates into the atmosphere, and then the toxic canopy of heavy metals created is relentlessly blasted with massively powerful radio frequency microwave transmissions. What could go wrong? What could go wrong? And we have all sides of the fence ignoring this glaring elephant in the room above our heads. The left, the right, all ignoring this. Has Trump ever spoken a word of truth about the ongoing climate engineering insanity? No, not a word. Has Mr. Jones, InfoWars, or Lord Monckton and other so-called independent sources mentioned a word about climate engineering in their recent factless rants praising Trump for playing the part the military-industrial complex and the fossil fuel industry wanted him to play, by stirring up yet more controversy and division, by pulling out of the Paris Accord, which again meant nothing anyway? Pulling out was simply a ploy to create the division and confusion that I'm alluding to. Are any of those praising Trump for his continued loot, plunder, and pillage programs bringing up the climate engineering factor in the equation? The weather warfare assault has been radically ramped up to ever more extreme levels under the Trump facade administration. Why no mention of this from these independent sites that I've spoken about, or the individuals who are towing the line for the military-industrial complex and the fossil fuel industry complex? Why no mention, during all their rants about climate, no mention of the single largest climate-disrupting factor of all? No mention in the recent days. Others are also touting that more CO2 the better. The more CO2 the better. This is a narrative of mindless idiocy, and a reminder for those who have bought this narrative. And from people like Mr. Monckton, who has repeatedly and adamantly denied climate engineering on the record, stated there's nothing wrong with the oceans, nothing wrong with the planet, nothing wrong with the biosphere, nothing wrong with the atmosphere. I would ask this. How can such people who buy this claim to be fighting against climate engineering at the very same time singing praises for the administration that's ramping geoengineering up to ever more extreme levels? How can such sources claim to be fighting geoengineering while at the very same time pushing con artists like Mr. Monckton, who completely again denies the issue of climate engineering on the record? And for those that want to know more about Mr. Monckton, you can also search this headline. Search Lord Monckton's rap sheet and find out who this individual is, who also claimed, by the way, to have found a cure for AIDS. He's claimed a lot of things. It's an incredible rap sheet from this individual, and how can anybody take this person seriously? It's truly perplexing. Now let's cover both sides of the climate engineering denial fence. on the so-called progressive news sources, sources that are also the epitome of hypocrisy, sources like Link TV, Amy Goodman's Democracy Now!, Bill McGibbon's 350.org, sources like Bill Nye, Huffington Post, so many sources who pat themselves on the back as if they're some sort of environmental saviors. I would ask this of these sources, the so-called progressive sources. How can they claim to care about the environment and the climate while at the very same time completely denying, again, the single most environmentally destructive activity ever unleashed by the human race against the entire web of life, geoengineering? Here's a story from Link TV, so-called progressive, environmentally minded Link TV, which is nothing more than paid, controlled opposition. Here's a headline that they published. Why do people believe in, quote, chemtrails? This is from Link TV. This was a completely factless article that avoided the science terms, which I stress all of us should use. Geoengineering, climate engineering, solar radiation management. This article avoided the climate science terms because they didn't want anybody to find credible data. And this is coming from a so-called environmentally minded news source, Link TV. Absolute propaganda article, exactly what the power structure and the climate engineers would want this site to put out from Link TV. If you're a so-called self-labeled progressive person and you subscribe to Link TV and you know they're putting this kind of nonsense out, why do you support them? Why would you support Link TV? And the same is true with Amy Goodman, who I supported out of my pocket to the tune of over $10,000 when I had the resources to do it, spending it out of my own retirement account before that account evaporated in this battle. I spent that much airing Amy Goodman's Democracy Now! Throughout Northern California until I realized what she was about. That she was about half-truths. Like much of the other sites I've already mentioned, half-truths. As I've mentioned before, I've met Amy Goodman twice. I was very shocked at her very abrasive demeanor and her statement to a staff member that I know personally that she told, because she was confronted about being funded by the Ford Foundation, which is part of the power structure, and Amy responded with this: well, at least I get most of the truth out. No, Amy, there's not most of the truth. As I stated before, a ship doesn't float because it's mostly watertight. It has to be the truth, the full truth. And if Amy Goodman and Link TV's followers believe that if it was happening, these so-called progressive news sources would tell them, then these sources are in fact doing far more harm than good by deceiving their viewers into thinking if it was happening that they would be told, and they're not being told. Disinformation. At that point, Link TV, Amy Goodman, 350.org, Bill Nye, McGibbon, the rest, all disinformation. All disinformation. So many on both sides of the fence are fitting this category right now. And while the house is burning down, they're contributing to the mass distraction and disinformation. It's up to us. It's up to each of us as individuals to find out what the truth is by our own investigation with no bias, no preconception, no tribalism. So much of that going on right now. You can't call it anything else. People, just like with religions, they're engaged in tribalism. That doesn't help save life on Earth. We have to have objective thinking, and we don't have much of that. We don't have many who are also willing to rise to their responsibility of becoming a part of the fight for the common good. And if we don't do that, sitting on the bench doesn't help. Sitting on the bench and criticizing those that are actually on the playing field without doing anything yourself doesn't help. And each of us can play a part in what needs to be done, and that is sharing credible data. Sharing hard, credible data with sources that would care if they knew. Hold them accountable. What's happening on the biosphere front line? What's really happening? While we have some of the sources I mentioned and individuals I mentioned telling us that there's nothing wrong, the planet's fine, it's all a hoax, everything's great. Here's what's happening on the front line, and these headlines are not disputed. They're simply not mentioned by such sources. Here's a headline from the front lines of what's occurring to Earth's ice deposits. This story is being covered by all major sources, and it's only an example of what's unfolding on our rapidly incinerating planet, with climate engineering helping to fuel the overall fire. Massive Antarctic, this is from last week, a few days old. Massive Antarctic ice shelf, Larsen C, is set to break off. From that report, scientists say the rift could produce a new iceberg of about 1,900 square miles, leaving the main ice shelf likely to collapse. Larsen A and Larsen B already gone. Now we're at Larsen C, massive ice shelf. The report continues, the saga of the Larsen C crack is about to reach a stunning conclusion. Scientists have watched a rift grow along one of Antarctica's largest ice shelves for years. Now it's in its final days. It's the latest dreary news from the icy underbelly of the planet, which has seen warm air and water reshape the landscape in profound ways. Final statement from this report. This news comes on the same day that U.S. President Donald Trump announced he would pull his country out of the Paris Agreement to limit climate change. Consider what's happening at the front lines. If you look at photographs of this, so you don't have to believe me or anyone else, it looks like something from the Day After Tomorrow movie, a massive crack in the ice over 100 miles long and extremely deep as this incredibly huge chunk of ice is about to break off of Antarctica. And it's not just the ice that breaks off that matters. That ice is part of the footing for the glaciers that keeps those glaciers from sliding into the sea. What happens now? We know what happened with Larsen A and B. As soon as such a break-off occurred, they disintegrated. Now that's happening with Larsen C. Huge headlines. Look it up yourself. Don't believe me. Another headline. Thawing permafrost will release more powerful greenhouse gas nitrous oxide. From that report. New research shows nitrous oxide emissions from the warming Arctic are much greater than previously thought. What have I stated over and over the whole course of this radio broadcast over the last 2 years and throughout the 10-plus year, almost 15 years now that I've been in this battle, that it's much worse than anything Mr. Gore said. I've said over and over, Mr. Gore's data was wrong. It's far worse than anything Gore said. And Gore's a hypocrite, as I've stated over and over. I have no love for this individual who, like all the other sites I just mentioned, who claims to be fighting against climate engineering, or climate change, and at the same time owns stocks in the very companies he claims to be fighting. The epitome of hypocrisy. That being said, as I've stated over and over the last decade plus, it's far worse than anything Gore said, and these reports that I keep going over week after week confirm that. So we see the release of nitrous oxide far worse than previously thought. The report continues, and this gas will add to climate change and damage the ozone layer. What have I stated in recent weeks' broadcasts also from the NASA engineer that's working for us? The ozone layer is disintegrating. Climate engineering is making that worse, not better. Climate engineering, a huge factor in this equation, not mentioned by this report, of course, because they can't mention it and still keep their doors open. But we have all these greenhouse gases, methane, CO2, nitrous oxide, all contributing to the blanket that's heating our planet. And for those who have convinced themselves this isn't so, I would ask such people, what do you think is warming the planet? What do you think allows the planet to even retain any heat at all? Is it just magic? Or is it greenhouse gases? Which is it? Is there a magic thermostat that keeps the planet at a certain temperature? No. There's factors that allow that to happen, and greenhouse gases are those factors. What happens when you increase the amount of those gases? And no one can rationally deny that they're not increasing. It gets warmer. It starts to trap more and more heat. Climate engineering, creating short-term toxic chemically engineered cooldowns, creating even more heat overall, short-term cooldowns in exchange for a worsened overall warming. And why am I so focused on this issue and the environmental ramifications over and over? Because, with frontline headlines to back it up every week, because when the planet doesn't support life, nothing else matters. And as the planet nears that point where it can't support the populations that's here, the power structure becomes unimaginably dangerous, and they start to use some of the weapons they've been building up over the last century. That's where we're at. But it all comes back down to the state of the environment. Continuing from this report about the radically increasing nitrous oxide levels, thawing ground inside the Arctic Circle could release as much nitrous oxide, that's N2O by the way, into the atmosphere as tropical rainforests do, previously the biggest known natural emitter of the powerful global warming gas. The process that removes nitrous oxide from the atmosphere also depletes ozone. So nitrous oxide is not only a greenhouse gas, but also an ozone destroyer, the report states. The vast stocks of nitrogen, more than 67 billion tons, in the permafrost has accumulated over thousands of years, and it could now become available for decomposition, leading to the release of massive amounts of nitrous oxide into the atmosphere. Nitrous oxide, N2O, is a strong greenhouse gas that's 300 times more powerful than CO2 for warming the climate. Methane, as I've stated over and over, just to add this to the report, 100 to 120 times more potent than CO2 over a 10-year time horizon. But nobody talks about this, do they? Not the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, not the fossil fuel industry supporting sites, as I just went over in the beginning of this broadcast, that sound like fossil fuel industry, military, industrial complex, climate engineering complex lobbyists. That's what they sound like. They never mention any of these gases, do they? At a global scale, this study puts Arctic nitrous oxide emissions from thawing permafrost in a range of emissions that would rival fossil fuel combustion, industrial processes, and biomass burning. Consider that. This one factor could add as much to the equation as all the anthropogenic activity has produced of CO2. Methane, the story is even worse. It's even worse than this. If one half, consider this equation I'm about to give you. This is not part of the report. This is simply data that should be heard. It's believed there's enough methane in the Arctic alone, in the Laptev Sea, perhaps as much as 10,000 gigatons. If 1/2 of that methane is released, 1/2 of 50 gigatons, that would be a 400% increase to the total overall greenhouse gas forced warming. 1/2. So there's enough methane there to turn the planet into Venus, and it's releasing. And climate engineering is making it worse, not better. We don't hear any of these sites, left, right, any of them discussing this. None of them. So back to my point. Mass distraction, this whole Paris Conference Accord, the whole Paris Accord to begin with was nothing but a facade. Pulling out of it is another facade, all designed to create division and confusion and infighting and distraction, so that nobody's paying attention while the house is burning to the ground. Single greatest leap we could take in the right direction. Not the only leap we must take, but the single greatest immediate leap. Exposing and halting climate engineering. More headlines. This is from the Express Tribune. Pakistan's hottest day just recorded in Terbat. Records falling day after day after day. Islamabad, this is from the report. Citizens of Terbat sweltering through the hottest day ever recorded in Pakistan's history as the mercury shot up to 53.5 degrees C. That was a week ago. I believe that's pushing 130 degrees there. These are astoundingly hot temperatures. People are dying in Pakistan, Africa, India. We don't hear anything about it here. Nothing. Because the industrialized nations are being geoengineered at such a radical scale that it's masking some of the warming that's going on at the cost of making it worse overall. Short-term covering up of the problem at the cost of making it exponentially worse overall. And poisoning every breath we take. Nobody mentions that. In fact, let's consider that with the whole climate science community, all of whom are discussing geoengineering as something that we must do. We must fill the atmosphere with these particles. Do any of them ever mention that, oh, by the way, what goes up must come down, and we will all breathe this, as we have been for the last 70 years? Is it any wonder that our species is getting sicker and sicker, the environment is imploding? And I would ask this of the science community, academia, the climate science community, in this case in particular, what a complete betrayal of them to never mention these toxic particles from climate engineering and what they will do to everything, what they have done already. No mention of at all. Total betrayal from the climate science community. Another headline, maximum damage. This is the headline, maximum damage. What's going wrong in our deep blue and warming seas? From that report, weeks of heat waves are a long time when you're a marine organism, a small creature at the bottom of the food chain. The report states, a paper published in Geophysical Research Letters this month highlights the extent of warmth that wasn't being captured by the readily available surface temperature measurements, hiding data, hiding massive UV radiation, hiding the true extent of warming. As I've stated before, the readings that we monitor at geoengineeringwatch.org, temperature readings, official high temperature readings, are routinely underreported by 4 and 5 degrees. The official readings are 4 to 5 degrees lower than the temperatures that actually occurred on the ground. This is plugging back into what I've said over and over, that the situation is far worse than we're being told. Far worse. Continuing from the report on the ocean warming, satellites are not getting the full picture. An associate professor at UNSW's Coastal and Regional Oceanography Lab stated they are missing the peak intensity and sometimes the duration of marine heat waves. Underreporting. That's what I've said over and over. Continuing from the report, bursts of heat can also take their toll. The extreme event off Western Australia in 2010-2011, the worst recorded in 160 years of records, killed about 150 kilometers of the kelp's range, which has never recovered. Final statements from the report. We should be as concerned about the loss of kelp as we are for the loss of coral, she said, adding the 8,000-kilometer stretch of kelp forests in Australia's southern coastal waters, with its abalone, lobster, and other industries generated in the past $10 billion a year from economic activity. Everything's measured in economic activity, isn't it? As if that really matters when your planet doesn't support life. It doesn't matter. So this report is true in this sense that we've all heard about the Great Barrier Reef dying, and there's a report on that in a moment I want to get to that's even more dire. Nobody talks about the kelp forests, which are a far bigger ecosystem overall. As I've stated in the past, I've had the great fortune to have spent an immense amount of time in those kelp forests, from California to New Zealand. And it's unimaginably beautiful and unimaginably heartbreaking to know that those ecosystems are imploding by the day. I would spend hours alone in those forests, gliding through the shafts of kelp, sometimes rising 100 foot or more up from the seafloor, with light that glistened through those shafts like a medieval forest, and so much life contained within those ecosystems, with every imaginable type of fish, seals, all making those forests their home. And I had camouflage wetsuits to help me blend into that ecosystem so that I could more easily observe the behavior of the life that existed there, and to know that it's completely unraveling is hard to bear. It's difficult to bear. And when I hear people like Lord Monckton claiming it's all fine, when he has no clue, offers no facts, that has never been where I've been or seen what I've seen and what others are trying to report from the front lines, that's criminal. That's absolutely criminal. I'm asking you to investigate people like this and investigate those who support people like this who are not telling the truth. I'm asking for investigation, for a true search of the truth. More headlines. Authorities say coral bleaching is worsening. Coral bleaching on the Great Barrier Reef last year was even worse than expected, while the full impact of the most recent event has yet to be determined. Queensland government officials say aerial and in-water surveys taken throughout 2016 had confirmed an escalating impact from north to south. Worse than was reported, because the goal of agencies is to downplay the severity of what's happening, to keep the public calm, to pacify the population. That's what they're there for. Another headline, Great Barrier Reef can no longer be saved. New headline from last week. Australian experts concede. From that report, the Great Barrier Reef, the canary in the coal mine for climate change, again, no mention of climate engineering, which they should address, can no longer be saved in its present form because of the extraordinarily rapid warming of the climate. Experts have conceded. And it's also UV, also not mentioned in this report. The UV is off the scale. That's a major factor, and they will not report on that because that's a result of, most directly, of climate engineering and other factors related to it that are forcing nitrous oxide release, methane release. No mention of climate engineering. We have to get the climate engineering elephant in the room acknowledged. We have to. We must all work together toward that. From that report, final statement, like coral across the world, the reef has been severely damaged by the warming of the oceans, with up to 95% of the areas surveyed found to have been bleached. Done. Great Barrier Reef's done. What happens when the reefs fall apart, the oceans warm, climate disintegrates, more cyclonic rotations, and they're happening everywhere around the world except the U.S. Any coincidence? No. Industrialized nations, like the U.S., suppressing cyclonic rotations, which worsens the ocean warmings. This headline from Bangladesh. Cyclone Mora ravages refugee camps in Bangladesh. The cyclone has destroyed almost 10,000 thatched huts in Bangladesh camps. We don't hear about that in the U.S., do we? Thousands of houses in the refugee camps have been damaged as severe cyclone storm battered Bangladesh's coastal areas. Cyclone Mora made landfall on Tuesday morning, this is last Tuesday, with heavy rains and winds. Almost 10,000 homes destroyed, thatched huts. Most of the temporary houses in the camps have been flattened. No coincidence with that. This is weather warfare, slaughtering those who are the most vulnerable. And this is not to say that if climate engineering wasn't going on, we wouldn't have events like this. Not at all. We're going to have cataclysmic events if and when we can stop climate engineering because of what's called double catastrophe scenario. When you start climate engineering and you inflict this kind of intervention for 70 plus years, you build up immense pressure in the system that has to be released on top of all the other anthropogenic activities. So we are truly in a corner at this point, with climate engineering making it worse by the day. Another headline, 1 million African migrants may be en route to Europe, says former UK envoy. Warning comes as EU struggles to stem the flow of migrants throughout the Mediterranean to deal with appalling conditions in detention camps. Lots of reason for the migrants. When you bomb countries, when you destroy the Middle East, when you wipe out infrastructure, you create massive refugee problems. And then what's the U.S. do? And other Western countries, they wash their hands of what they created themselves. Same with the climate engineering, creating drought in Africa. For how long? You get more rain on a warming world, not less. You must have more rain unless there's a factor that's not being acknowledged. That factor is climate engineering. Doesn't mean there's not deluges, lots of deluges, and there will be more deluges as the pressure builds up in the system. But climate engineering overall is thwarting the Earth's hydrological cycle and creating more drought than deluge. Although both exist, don't think dichotomously. It's not just this or that, it's all the above. What's NASA doing? As I've covered some about NASA in recent articles and their continued deception in so many arenas, NASA to release artificial clouds above Maryland. Wonderful. Let's experiment with the weather more, as if the climate's not already decimated enough. From that report, a space weather experiment should be visible in Maryland as NASA launches a rocket to create colorful clouds. They make it sound so benign, don't they? The report continues. It's caused by the bombardment of highly energized particles from the sun striking the Earth's protective magnetic field. This week, NASA hopes to study these particles over the mid-Atlantic by creating a kind of artificial aurora. Let's just experiment with the atmosphere until it no longer functions. NASA is a branch of the military-industrial complex. They're a part of the cancer. That's all they are. They do whatever they want because they can, because we let them. And if we continue to let them, we're not going to be here much longer. Another headline, key greenhouse gases higher than at any time over the last 800,000 years. These are hard frontline facts. They're real. They're a part of the problem. Climate engineering is making it worse, not better. From that report, the most recent comprehensive collection of atmospheric greenhouse gas measurements confirm the relentless rise of many of the most important greenhouse gases, the most devastating, as I already mentioned, not just CO2, but CH4, methane, and nitrous oxide as well. The data shows that today's aggregate warming effect of CO2, CH4, and nitrous oxide is higher than at any time over the last 800,000 years, according to ICE core records. These are facts. These are frontline facts. Not about Al Gore, about facts. Climate engineering making it worse. Overall, short-term toxic cool-downs at the cost of shredded ozone layer, completely contaminated surface of the planet, disrupted hydrological cycle, disrupted upper air currents, disrupted ocean currents. Now we have warm water pumping into the Arctic. That's thawing methane. That's migrating through the water column to the sea surface, entering the atmosphere, adding to the blanket of greenhouse gases. The shredded ozone layer releases lethal UV radiation that has a very penetrating heat. You can feel this on any surface if the sun's fully exposed now. It's not your imagination that the sun feels warmer. It is radically warmer. I'll have more reports from the NASA engineer that's working directly with geoengineeringwatch.org soon. I'll try to get frontline data out as fast as I can, but we need to understand that this is real. What's happening to the biosphere is real. And because a few would appear to be paid actors from certain sources tell us it isn't so, and we want to believe that, That doesn't make it not so. What's happening is real. It's happening at unimaginable speed. We must deal with it. We must fully face reality. And for those, and I hear from these people a lot who don't like such dark messages. As I've stated before, how do you avoid traffic when you're in the freeway and you want to turn your back to it? Do you sit in your lawn chair with your back to traffic? How is that going to save you? You have to face reality. You have to face traffic if you're to have any chance of surviving. You can only deal with reality by facing it fully, not halfway, not with sites like Democracy Now! And Link TV and all the other ones I mentioned that are from different directions, not telling the truth. Not telling the truth. Different ideologies with different followers who want to believe different things, none of them willing to face reality on all sides of the fence. This is what's occurring. It must stop. There must be a uniting of the tribes to facing reality and dealing with the largest priority issues first, or we have no chance. Stopping climate engineering should be our top priority. So, to reiterate, what happens when we have a power structure that's desperate, pushed into a corner, biosphere imploding, no other cards to play, global conflict is played? And what are they doing to play that? And there may be a fracturing in the power structure when we have warmongers like John McCain claiming this, quote, democracy destroying Russia is bigger threat than terrible ISIS. And what about the biosphere imploding, Mr. McCain? Any mention of that? So this whole Russia thing, and this is one arena where I would certainly consider the potential fracturing of the power structure for the relentless attacks against Mr. Trump and using the Russia threat as the ploy for that. It's nonsense. It's complete nonsense. And if you're buying into the Russia is a threat and Russia hacked our democratic system because they supposedly exposed the crimes of Hillary Clinton, if you buy into that, if you're on the left, and the left is the one that seems to buy that, then you're a part of the problem. Why shouldn't we know about the crimes of the Clintons? The Clintons should be in jail. So should the Bushes. So should the Obamas. And I would argue Trump is in the same category. They're all part and parcel of the power structure facade, all of them. So when the power structure is pushed into a corner, they will push for global conflict. That's what's happening. We have this kind of statement coming from McCain. We had McCain and Lindsey Graham state this: Russia is undermining democracy all over the world. Really? While we have the U.S., the absolute world leader in interfering with other countries' businesses, invading, occupying, destroying. Who are they to point the finger at Russia in this case? Those that can't see through this anti-Russia propaganda being pumped out from the criminal corporate media companies like CNN and MSNBC and the rest. If you can't see through this propaganda, you need to clear your lens. This is complete nonsense, simply trying to galvanize the public for potential conflict because the environment is imploding. So perhaps we have separate factions of the power structure. Trump and his entourage on one side and the corporate media on the other, and other aspects of the power structure. But does that make either of them not criminals? It doesn't. They're just different potential factions of the power structure, both criminal. All criminal. In the meantime, used for distraction to divide and confuse the population while the planet implodes around us. One final statement from McCain. McCain said this: the Russians have tried to destroy the very fundamentals of democracy, and that is to change the outcome of an American election. What complete nonsense from McCain and all those like him, and from the mainstream media that support such false narratives like that from McCain, CNN, MSNBC, and so forth. And although this particular attack against Mr. Trump and his administration is not justified, does that change what the Trump administration has done and what those who control the Trump administration have done? Does that change their crimes? No, it does not. They're just simply, again, different branches of what amounts to a criminal cabal that's currently running the planet. If we don't look at all the factors in the equation, all the parts of the puzzle, how can we see the picture clearly? We can't. We're all swimming in a sea of lies and deception, and the majority of our society has so far chosen not only to accept the lies, but all too often to embrace the lies. If we don't collectively wake up and face the full unspun truth and alter our current course, we'll reach the end of the Anthropocene era. the age of man. We may also bring down the entire web of life with us. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to do legitimate investigation, to clear the lens through which you view the world. The fight for the greater good is a burden that must be borne by us all. Until next week, this is Dane Wigington with geoengineeringwatch.org.
Oh,